Oh, wow. And then there was light. Wow. Well, good evening, everyone. Noswaith dda, a croeso I Pier Head. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this rather beautiful bonkers building we call the Pier Head. My name is Rosemary Butler. I have the great honour of being the presiding officer here at the National Assembly for Wales. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome our guest Sylvia Ann Hewlett here this evening to talk about the value of having women in senior positions and decision-making roles. She's not alone. She's come with the whole family with her. So, family are not allowed to heckle, by the way. So please feel free to speak in Welsh or English during the question and answer session. Both languages are now official working languages here at the Assembly, and headsets are available for those who need English translation. I'm really pleased to see you all here today, particularly with the difficulties you've had in getting here with the fire in the tunnels. But this is one of our series of lectures that I've been hosting as part of my Women in Public Life campaign, aimed at getting more women in Wales involved in public life by becoming magistrates, councillors, lawyers, school governors, or seeking other public appointments. Now, central to that campaign is providing strong role models through a series of keynote lectures here at the Pier Head. And I know a number of you have been to some of those lectures, which have been quite inspirational. Many of you will know that I spent much of the last 3 years encouraging more women into public life. I hosted regional seminars where we heard from women in traditionally male-dominated sectors who would overcome barriers to be taken seriously and become successful in their professions. Tonight's event forms part of our programme to mark International Women's Day, which has been a great success in raising the issue of gender inequality in the corridors of power and influence. And this year has been quite phenomenal, because it hasn't been International Women's Day, it's been International Women's Month. And I've spoken at so many events this year, it's been a real thrill. And the final one I was going to speak at was last Friday morning in my own constituency, in the Celtic Manor, which is in my constituency. My constituency is in the Celtic Manor, but something like that. We used to say the Celtic Manor was in Killeen, now we say Killeen is in the Celtic Manor, because it's very big. But I went along to talk to some girls, trying to get them into careers which are non-traditional women's careers, but into men's jobs. And I went and I walked in this very big hall, which was empty, but it was full of chairs. And I said to the woman who organised it, well, where are we doing the speaking? She said, in here. And I said, well, it's going to be a bit hollow. Oh, she said, no, it'll be fine. And there were 600 girls came and sat down, and another 120 stood at the back. Now, I've never spoken to 720 people when I'm sober. I may have done when I'm drunk, but I don't remember doing it then. But it was just fantastic to see these girls so enthused and, asking about what kind of jobs they have. And I always say to girls, you do what the boys do, because that's where the money is. Never mind for the girls' jobs, go for the boys' jobs. But why do we need more women in decision-making positions? Well, I recently heard of the Chinese say that the 50% of the sky is held up by women. And I thought, well, that's really rather a nice thing to remember. So why do we need more women in decision-making positions? Well, evidence and research shows there are many good reasons why we need our decision-makers to come from more diverse backgrounds. Greater diversity at top tables leads to different issues being put on the agenda and actually discussed at meetings. And decisions are more likely to take account of different viewpoints, which leads to more responsive services and better business practice. And diversity helps organisations to be more connected with the people they serve or represent. And here at the Assembly, I'm really proud, of the number of women we have here, but also that we encourage diversity. Not because we have a legal duty to, which we do, but because it is the right thing to do and we want to do it. Now, my Women in Public Life campaign is focusing on providing practical solutions to help women in Wales overcome the obstacles, stopping them from taking significant steps into public life or the next step in their chosen career. Now, our guest here this evening, if I may say, is a real bottle of pop. I've just met her half an hour ago, but I'm blown away. So she's certainly broken those barriers and become a globally renowned economist and author. And I look forward to hearing about her journey from the Welsh Valleys to New York. Sylvia is the founder and CEO of the Centre for Talent Innovation, a New York-based think tank that leverages, very American word, that leverages talent across the divides of gender, generation, geography, and culture. Sylvia's work focuses on ensuring that senior executives make the most of the range of talent available and highlights that diversity is the key to success. She has particularly concentrated on the challenges and opportunities faced by women, minority groups, and other previously excluded individuals when seeking to climb the career ladder. An author of 12 critically acclaimed books, amongst them Off-Ramps and On-Ramps, and her most recent work, Executive Presence. Sylvia has inspired many women to put themselves forward for promotion, to apply for a new job, and more importantly, to find a work-life balance that works for the individual. Now, in 2013, she was awarded the Woman of the Year Award from the Financial Women's Association, and in 2013, she received the Work-Life Legacy Award from the Families and Work Institute. Now, I've always believed, that successful women should not pull the ladder up behind them, and they have to reach out to help other women to succeed in their careers. And Sylvia is an example of someone who has left that ladder there and inspiring other women to realise their potential. I'm really honoured that Sylvia has accepted my invitation to participate in this campaign, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her story. I'm confident that we'll all leave here inspired by her words. So please give our guest a very warm welcome, Sylvia.
So a huge thank you to Dame Rosemary Butler. I think we discovered half an hour ago that we were both girls from the valleys. So it's fantastic to be back in Wales. A huge thank you to my husband, Richard, to my daughter, Emma, to my sister, Helen, and a very precious group of friends who are also with us this evening. So I want to start with a little bit about my journey. These are some photographs that Helen and I dug up. We've discovered that right now we cannot find a picture of all 6 girls. This is just 5. I think our parents, gave up on photography once the 6th rolled around. But the thing I found so poignant was my grandmother, who is obviously in the top left-hand corner. She was 5 years younger than I am now when that photograph was taken. She was a very wonderful woman, but careworn beyond her years. So I just want to start by sharing with you my thoughts this last month when Rosemary asked me to come and talk here, because what I wanted to do was find the story that summoned up the poignancy of why, I was so propelled, so inspired to spend a few decades, worrying about women's advancement. At age 9, our family moved to a very, very busy and rather dangerous main road just outside of Pontypool. The primary school was just under a mile away. In order to get there, you had to cross 4 or 5 pretty dangerous intersections. This was in the days before crossing guards, school lunches, and we certainly didn't have a car in the family. So every morning, my mother used to set out to keep us safe, this trek to primary school. At 8 o'clock, at 12 o'clock, 1:30, 4 o'clock, 8 times a day. And obviously, she had 3 little girls in tow and a baby in a pushchair. Actually, Helen was the youngest of the ambulatory children at that point. And it wasn't such a pleasant journey. Sheets of Welsh rain were often, pouring down on us. And we arrived home, with chattering teeth and wet socks. And looking back on it, obviously, I am kind of gobsmacked at the time commitment, and the extraordinary, commitment of her girls to make sure they didn't get run over that fell out of her life. The amazing thing is this went on for 14 years. Because when I was 11, I moved on to Pontypool Grammar School and was able to catch a bus. But there were 4 younger sisters in the pipeline. And she did it for another 12 years. So how did this woman find the time to shop, cook, care for us? I mean, we didn't have a washing machine, so, the washing on the line was often frozen. Let alone wash her hair or worry about her dreams and her desires. But obviously for the women that came before us, that kind of extraordinary other-directed energy was so much a drumbeat of their lives. In my late 20s, I discovered an American feminist. Her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wrote in the 1880s, and she was a woman with 5 children who got to her goals in her 40s. And she was a wonderful writer about how women need not obliterate their own dreams in order to be a good family member. And in her first book, I still remember this sentence, she wrote it in capital letters: self-fulfillment is a higher goal than self-sacrifice. And I remember that book gave me permission to understand that I did not want the life of my mother. Clearly, I wanted a rich, committed family life, but I also wanted a life of playing on a larger stage. And the one I chose, obviously, was to make a whole bunch of more generous choices available to women. Our mother died 3 years ago this spring, and that story, I think, symbolizes the amazing self-sacrifice of so many traditional women. What I want to share with you this evening are 3 pieces of my work. And not only do I have the 12 books, but the thing that I'm most in touch with is the fact that I have forced action. I was in public policy for a bunch of years, but when George W. took over the White House, I decided there was not much room for me in that administration, and I've been working with the private sector for the last 11 years to great effect. There are 250 new best practices out there, and they're making a difference. Employers count. So let's look at these 3 pieces of work. First off, obviously inspired in part by my mother, I've been incredibly dedicated to figuring out how women can do both things. Family for sure. But also, the life of commitment and an ability to actually drive your own vision. So, at the basis of this work is this book I did on off-ramps and on-ramps, which really centered on the notion that right around the world, and we did this study in Japan, in India, in the UK, as well as the US, most women who are educated will take some break from work. And for that break, they're punished. If you look at the figures, they're amazing. Take 3 years out of work, and you lose almost 40% of your earning power permanently. The punishment does not fit the crime. Because what we discovered in this path-breaking work is that women these days only take a brief break. They don't float into the sunset for 15 years. They can't afford to. But these breaks, which in the UK are 2.7 years, can clobber your earning power. In fact, the wage gap in both the US and in the UK is primarily a result of this break in employment, because you never catch up. So what I've been doing is pushing and shoving amazing companies like BT, and Binion is in the room. She was totally at the forefront of this, to actually be important players in ensuring that well-qualified women can get back on track without paying this punishing price. So to just give you an example, BT has made sure that both men and women can have immensely flexible schedules, so that employers don't just discriminate against a woman because she's the one that's about to take the leave. At BT, both men and women, it's an equal opportunity thing. So it's much more likely to create a fair result. But one of the companies I'm most admiring of is EY. It used to be called Ernst & Young. What they've done there, they've created a whole career track that's 3/4 time. So you can be a partner at this company on a 4-day-a-week job. This has transformed their ability to hang on to their female talent. The other thing they do is that no one at Ernst & Young really takes a total break. If you go on maternity leave, you're actually paid incredibly well to come into work 1 day a month. Why? You don't lose your network. You don't lose the immediacy of your connection with those that matter at work. So when you come back, you're much more likely to be successful. And you're not put on a slow road to nowhere, which oftentimes can happen after a maternity break. Moving on, the second piece of research I want to talk about is some very influential work, influential because there are 19 major organizations that are putting it to work. It's the work I've done on sponsorship. This is a book I wrote 2 years ago. It came out in 2013. It's work we've now done in 4 different nations so that, again, the characteristics, the insights, the traction is way beyond New York or the US. So what is the foundation of this work? Women have been palmed off with the second best reality. We've got a ton of mentors. In fact, we have 3 times more than men. But we only have half as many sponsors. A senior person who'll really haul you up the ladder after you. And I'll tell a story. When I took my first job, and I was an assistant professor of economics at Barnard College in New York City, I thought I had my ducks in a row. I thought I knew how to succeed. I run the gauntlet of all those degrees. I had a fabulous husband and, a small child. I was on track. I thought what you needed as a young professional was an amazing mentor. And I'm not really putting mentors down. It's wonderful to have a supportive sounding board in your life. Everyone should have a mentor. So I went out and I found an amazing traditional mentor. It was a woman, a senior woman at Barnard College, who took a huge interest in me. She saw me as a way of paying it forward, giving a gift to a younger woman. And she gave me amazing advice, took me out to lunch, and I, shared every crisis in my career with her. The problem was, when I came up for tenure, 6 years later, which is the great career leap in academia, she was totally useless. Not because she wasn't well-meaning and didn't wish me well, but she had no power. She was a medieval historian. She had quarreled with the dean 10 years previously and was on no important committee. What I needed was someone who had power at the table where my case was being discussed. So what happened to me? I went through all the early decisions with flying colors. I could tick all the boxes, the research, the teaching prizes, whatever. But when I reached the final committee of Columbia University, there were 5 people on that committee, and no one knew who the heck I was. I was unknown. the power structure. Because I had not been sitting at the feet of, significant eminences, giving papers at the weekend at conferences, because I had 2 small kids. I was doing the job. I was doing it fabulously. But I was not networking at the top. I did not have a sponsor. They had 2 slots that year. 5 fabulous candidates. I'm not sure whether I was worse or better than them. All I know is that I was not picked. They did not know me. I needed a powerful sponsor. So what do we find in the economy in general? There's a ton of women in the middle ranks these days. We really cracked that. 34% of what I call the marzipan layer, that rich and sticky layer just below the top, is now female, incredibly well qualified. But go right to the top and the numbers haven't changed in years. I'll give you an example. Law firms in the City of London, the magic circle. It's a very interesting phrase. 16% of those law firms, right? 16% of the partners are female. That figure was precisely the same 15 years ago. If you look at the US, 7.8% of the top earners in the economy are female. That figure was the same 25 years ago. Things have not shifted at the top. So we did a lot of research in terms of what was the barrier. It's not credentials, it's not performance, it's no longer experience, right? It's sponsorship. Who taps who on the shoulder for the next powerful position? When we roll out sponsorship programs at our companies, then I'll give you 3 examples the last 2 years. American Express, Intel, Citi, huge companies, they put in place pathways to sponsorship for their top women. And guess what? They're really changing the numbers at the top. We are measuring what works. Sponsorship is the magic bullet. So let's talk a little bit about what sponsors really are, and so we can just, understand the difference between traditional mentoring and sponsorship. So this sponsor person that's going to get you to the next opportunity needs to be someone who's senior to you, who has a seat on a table that's important as a door-opening thing for you, who is willing to take a bet on you, who believes in you, and will advocate for you in rooms where you're not present. The other thing we find is that this person needs to have your back, needs to provide a little air cover so you can take risks, because you do nothing worthwhile in the world without taking risks. What we find is the data says, women are risk adverse, they don't take risks nearly as much as men. We find that's not true. They're simply not suicidal. Unless you have a sponsor behind you, backing you up, picking you up, dusting you off, if you make a bad bet, you'd be silly to take a risk. Because if you fail, you get fired. So women with sponsors take exactly the same number of risks as men with sponsors. The problem is women are so unlikely to have a sponsor. So what we see is that the other side of the coin, the protege, the mentee, if you like, again, very different in sponsorship. Because you're asking a senior person to take a big bet on you, you've got to work for this. You have to earn it. It's not some kind of gift. It's not some kind of entitlement. You can't give someone a sponsor. So how do you make it work? Well, I wrote a whole book about this. I have 57 tactics. And these, again, the things on the left are the important things. Whatever your job, you've got to do it immensely well. That's table stakes. Number 2, you've got to be trustworthy to the team, to the cause, to the organization, to the leader, because no one's going to take a bet on you if you're bad-mouthing them behind their backs. I mean, this isn't going to work, right? And then the third thing is your own special brand. What makes you so valuable? And what I always say about this, we all have currency. Maybe it's a fantastic knowledge of the Welsh market. Or maybe you speak Mandarin. Or maybe you've got the most amazing social media skills. Whatever you have that the team doesn't have, shout it from the rooftops. It helps you get sponsored. So what we're talking about is this profoundly kind of reciprocal two-way street. Now, the Old Boys Club has been doing this for millennia. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We know that it happens, usually behind closed doors. We find that left to itself, it's a mini-me situation. Because the trust thing, imagining that this younger person has your back, is much easier to do if this person comes from the same background, right? Looks like you, talks like you. The reason that we've been so eager to put a lot of numbers around this, make it transparent, it makes it more accessible to the new kids on the block. Because we know that it's been going on for decades. Sponsorship is how power is transferred in organization. Now, power always gets transferred. People die, they retire, power moves on. Who does it move on to? And that is what sponsorship is. So, this is work that has been very powerful. We can show that women are much less likely to have a sponsor than men. People of color, minorities, just a tiny minority of these individuals are ever sponsored. Similarly for the LGBT group. The folks who are not, innately connected to those folks in power have rarely been sponsored. So just to sum this up, we can show in our data that men and women with sponsors are much more likely to ask for and get a pay raise. They're much more likely to stick around. Let me give you one figure from the UK. A woman coming back to work, having given birth to her second child, which is oftentimes the reason for an off-ramp, is 38% more likely to not just come back to work, to stay back at work if they have a sponsor. And why not? There's a senior person up there who believes in you, who's continuing to give you career opportunities, even though, obviously, you now have a fuller plate at home. So sponsorship has these measurable results. And of course, the other thing we can show very dramatically is the impact on whether you'll get that next job or not. So I'm incredibly, proud of the fact we now have, these programs out there. I just want to talk very simply about a very famous case of sponsorship in action. Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, a lean-in fame, right? And her sponsor, someone called Larry Summers, who was Secretary of the Treasury and a huge noise in terms of his various careers. So, the reason Sheryl Sandberg had such a golden route through her 20s and 30s is that she had an amazingly powerful sponsor. I'm not putting her down at all. She is a fantastically impressive woman. She was the top student at the Harvard Business School. She was selected by Larry, who was then at Harvard, as his research assistant. She delivered like crazy. She made a huge difference to his ability to impress the world. So when he went to the World Bank, and then when he went to the Treasury, she came with him as his chief of staff. Again, they perform like crazy for each other. It's a lifelong relationship. They really know how to turbocharge each other's ability. And, at the end of his stint at the Treasury, he opened a few doors in Silicon Valley, and the rest is history. So, Sheryl Sandberg did a lot of leaning in. But she would not have progressed as rapidly or as kind of perfectly without this amazing sponsor. And she's given back. 2 years ago, he was being considered as perhaps the head of the Fed, which is a huge post. All the women in America came out in favor of the only woman candidate, Janet Yellen, who got the job. Not Sheryl Sandberg. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying how Larry should get the job, that he was the finer economist and his brains would make all the difference. In other words, you can see the reciprocity of this. And of course, it goes on all the time, mostly behind closed doors, and mostly women are not the beneficiaries. The other thing we find, and this is almost, it's distressing, it's almost funny data. I wish it was old data, it's not. This is 2013. We find that one reason women are not tapped on the shoulder for sponsorship is that somehow they don't quite fit the mold. They're a little too loud. Perhaps they're going to be a troublemaker. Or they're a shrinking violet. It's very hard to get it right. Very little latitude. I love the last one. Women oftentimes as being seen as looking too young. They're not ready for this job. Or they're over the hill. They don't have enough runway left, as one CEO told me. So it turns out there are 3 years in there when we're just right. Men get 17 years. This is hidden bias, right? Popping up all over the place, particularly in terms of who gets chosen for sponsorship, which is why I'm so admiring of the 19 organizations that are now putting this in place very deliberately for women. Okay, so my final piece of research this evening. We've done a lot of work recently in terms of measuring why we should care. I mean, okay, sponsorship will get you to the top. Off-ramps and on-ramps need to be dealt with much more effectively if women are going to have a shot at staying on track. But why would a business person do this, right? What is the brand new, refreshed case about why we need urgently to care about this? So our two new studies, one is looking at wealth, the other one is looking at health. Health and wealth, big parts of our economy. In fact, about 40% of the economy. I mean, this is a big chunk of the GDP. What we did in these studies, let's take wealth. Let's take the US. Although we did this in 7 countries. Let's take the US. 62% of savings and assets, financial assets, are now controlled by women. And it's growing. And it's not just the wives and the widows, right? It's women who are creating new jobs, new businesses. 2/3 of all businesses in the States are now being started by women. The problem is the banking world, the financial advisory world, is a wall of white men. Women are not getting the products, the behaviors, the conversations that they want. As a result, huge amounts of the financial assets of families is under the mattress. We reckon that 20% of, again, savings, investable assets are held in cash, leaking out of the system, depressing GDP, who knows what else. Because women are really fed up in terms of what is on offer. They feel that they're not listened to, they feel they're condescended to, they also feel very profoundly that their needs are not met by the industry. So what do they want? First off, women want to align their assets, their savings, with the meaning and purpose of their lives. They want a big conversation about 3-generational security. They don't want to talk about yields this year. And that is a huge differentiator. They also want who's ever giving them advice to understand that they may well be the major breadwinner here. Think of our data. In 55% of professional families in the US, the UK, and Germany, women now out-earn men. So if you want to access these markets, you've got to have some gender smarts. You have to know, the subtle, the nuanced realities of this marketplace. You also need a whole set of new behaviors. And I'll tell a story from London. One of the people I interviewed for this research, her name is Fiona Cruikshank. She's 41 years old. She was a biotech entrepreneur, made a whole bunch of money in her early 30s, sold a company for £40 million. So she then went the round of the usual suspects, whether it was Lloyd's or Barclays, who knows what. That she went and talked to a lot of banks as to what she should do with her assets. Her dream was to use a whole bunch of it to create security for herself and her extended family. She does not have children. It was a complicated reality she had going on, a lot of elder care issues, for instance. But she also wanted to take 25% of it and become an angel investor for other startups, other women in the biotech space. So she turned up at Morgan Stanley and told this story, and the guy looked at her and said, he laughed, he said, "You can't be an angel investor. You don't have enough money. You can't be a player in this space." She walked out. Because, this is her money. She knew that in this small sector, she actually could make a difference, but having her ideas flicked off the table. Because for somehow, she was seen as not having deep enough pockets to qualify for meaning and purpose. Lost her as a customer. So we're now looking at health, and here's the thing. Here's the big thing in the market. Women make 96% of healthcare decisions. But again, the pharmaceutical industry, a wall of white men. So if you push and shove, what do you find? And I'll just share one thing. Men tend to see health, including those executives, as disease management. Women see health as wellness. Profoundly different point of view. So once you start seeing the consumer in healthcare as a she, it's a she economy. 96% of the decisions. That's almost all. So what we are able to do with this research is show the incredible importance of having some gender smarts around decision-making tables. If you are to capture new markets, and I'll just end the research with this one story. This woman on this slide, her name is Rajastri Nambiar. Standard Chartered in India made her the head of branch banking. The first time they'd ever put a woman in that kind of powerful role. Now, she knew from her own experience as a well-paid female executive that she got lousy service from the Indian banking system, including her own bank. So she said, look, I'll take this job, but I have one condition. Allow me to create 2 branches, one in Kolkata, one in New Delhi, that is staffed only by women, from the security guards to the top financial advisors. Allow me to show you, because the entire executive committee was male, that there is a whole marketplace out there for a different kind of financial advising. So they didn't quite know what she was getting at because they were all males. They had not been exposed to this kind of thinking, but they thought she was a rock star. She had delivered results. So they said, go ahead, try it out. We'll give you some rope. So she created these 2 new branches. She did some superficial stuff. She redecorated. She put in a coffee bar and some babysitting. She also created something called the Diva package, so that if you transferred your account there, you've got a spa thing going on. This was, I guess, a gimmick, but pretty appealing to the female audience. But more fundamentally, she did the most extraordinary amount of market research on the nuances of the female marketplace. And, lo and behold, it turns out not all women are the same. I mean, why do we expect that, right? Wealth, savings, assets in India, when created by women, are much, much more likely to be entrepreneurial monies than, salaries you earn at some large corporations. So she totally transformed the conversations, the projects, and all the rest of it. In 14 short months, these two branches became the most profitable in Asia. And I really thought, well, you should bring some of those ideas back to New York, because I could use one of those branches on the Upper West Side. This is a great set of ideas. So just to finish off, what we were able to show in this new research, and this particular study came out in the Harvard Business Review last winter. It's really very accessible. If you have at least 3 kinds of difference going on in terms of decision making, and you can, pick from a list, what are the 8 ones that are important? Well, it's language, it's generation, it's LGBT status, it's certainly gender, it's minority status, and we have seen in our data that there are 8 forms of difference that are the most important in terms of triggering innovation and growth. If you have at least 3 of them going on, you are 45% more likely to develop a new marketplace. This leads to growth. So this is the transformational research that lies behind, a lot of the work we're doing. And, right now we're doing it across 14 sectors, and it's very much in different countries of the world. So I'm back to where I began, which is 11 years ago, starting on this journey of involving employers in the advancement of women. We had 7 companies to begin with. Anne, where are you? You will remember you were one of the pioneers, Anne Banyan from BT, who's now obviously very famous in the Equalities Commission world. But now we have 86. Every year they write a check. There's a certain market discipline here. We are delivering value in terms of the impact of this work on recruiting, engagement, retention, and market growth. And I would just want to end with a story from my family. I obviously was talking about my mother as we opened tonight. I really need to say a word about my dad, our dad. Imagine it. The father in a family of 6 girls, 1 bathroom. Friday night hair washing was quite something to behold. And very, I think, much a man in transition. When we were little girls in Pontypool, my big sister and I used to get together and pray when my mother was giving birth for the boy. We knew that our unreconstructed, working class bloke of a dad so yearned for that boy baby. Of course, my mother never produced the boy. At age 43, she gave birth to her 6th daughter and officially gave up. But we were aware of the misogyny of the valleys. The thing that struck me is that even the choirs were male voice. It's hard to even sing and be, recognized for it. But I was 13 when the youngest daughter was born. And my dad, I guess, knuckled down and realized he should do something for the girls he happened to have. So there was a very famous April weekend where he took me by bus to look at Cambridge. We didn't have a car. I'd never been outside of Wales. He just wanted to show me this amazing campus, one of the finest, obviously, in Europe. And he had a very simple message, which is that if I worked hard, I could go there. Now, in a way, it was a ridiculous thought because I went to a school that had never sent anyone there, so why should I be the first? And it's also true that I wasn't a particularly good student at that time. My elder sister was the person that got all the prizes. I was squished in the middle. I hadn't got a whole lot of attention. But I was totally inspired by this dreaming spire, lashings of opportunity kind of reality. So I went back to Wales, and I did work very hard. But, there were two things going on which made me realize very profoundly that you never pull yourself up by your own bootstrap, right? Two things were happening. There was a government in Whitehall, right, which was forcing the ancient universities to open their doors much more widely to two groups, to girls and to kids from state schools, from less advantaged neighborhoods. So I clearly, was in the right place at the right time, and it was a transformative thing to go to Cambridge. I banged very much up against the whole class thing, and Rosemary and I were talking about it earlier, but I do recognize that, my dad was very much my sponsor. He saw a kind of potential that I'm not sure anyone else saw at that point, and 3 of us girls went to Cambridge. So thank you. I would love to take some questions. We have a mic coming.
Hello, I'm from the Valleys too, and I'm a lawyer, and I act for lots and lots of executive directors, and they're all men, so I would very much like to see more women. But my question to you, Sylvia, is this. In that sponsorship relationship you talked about in the picture with Sheryl Sandberg and Larry Summers, how do you deal with the issue that that kind of relationship can spill over into something else, or can be perceived to be something else? That if you seek a sponsor, are you seeking a husband or vice versa?
Right. That's an incredibly perceptive question. I have a whole chapter on this in my book. 64% of senior male leaders say that they would never sponsor a younger woman because they would be fearful of gossip. Right? The other side of the coin is that 50% of women say that they have trouble in really reaching out and very actively promoting themselves with a senior man for the same reason. So how do you overcome that? I'll take an example. American Express, one of the companies that is now 3 years into their sponsorship program. For starters, they say to all of their senior men, and the CEO is saying this, you need to sponsor at least 3 incredibly kind of on-track younger people. 2 of them cannot look like you. Pretty simple, right? We see it as a key capability of leadership. Expanding your scope, your span, your connection with the marketplace. It's very public. There are a few restaurants around American Express headquarters in New York. PJ Clark is a case in point. Everyone knows that the sponsors oftentimes go for a snack. I mean, you probably shouldn't meet at bars, right, at 12 o'clock at night, but there are certain places where it's now pretty public. And what has happened, it's made it legit. But you need that leadership, right? You need the folks at the top talking about this to make it, above board. Let's just drive this business together kind of thing. But it's worked. They've increased by 47% the number of women in the top band through the program. But it's a great question. Well, the thing is, It's a company of 120,000 people, so obviously, but the nice thing about American Express is that if something goes on, it's the senior person who's fired.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in England and Wales.
There you go. But I think you have to have some teeth, you know, in this. The other thing is, if you don't sponsor as a senior leader, your bonus is less.
That's very attractive.
I know. Accountability, a good idea. Of course you can, Bob. We need the mic so people.
Speaking of private companies,
Yeah.
and I was wondering how one can have a sponsor in public service. We've had an example recently where women were almost pushed to one side, and a man has taken the top job. I'm not quite sure how one could measure which was the better of the two. I think it was mainly because men were sort of making the choice in
Right.
a large degree. But how can one have a
Right.
sponsor in public service?
This study looked at all organizations. For instance, the Mayo Clinic, some departments of the UN, the State Department. We have public organizations as well as private organizations. The thing is, Barbara, in any organizations, leaders move on. Power is transferred. This is not just something, the reason I'm talking private sector is that they are doing more about it right now in the States. But this is universal. You know, the state government in Mumbai, you know, is doing the same thing. It is how power is transferred. Who do you tap on the shoulder? I'll tell an example from a London interview I did. 64-year-old CFO of a public charity, right? He'd just been asked, who was he going to throw his weight behind? He was retiring. And there was this short list of, 9 candidates. And as the outgoing person, he'd been asked for his opinion. That was a very weighty opinion. The selection committee would pay attention to it. So he looked at the candidates. He knew 3 of them very well. The one he thought was the outstanding candidate in terms of just sheer performance was the only woman on the list, right? But he was nervous. He said, look, I've never backed a woman for a top job before, a whole new experience, He was also a little nervous about her attitudes. He felt that she didn't have enough fire in her belly. Because in his experience, women were way too honest. Shared their failings and their ambivalences and all that kind of stuff. And he didn't think he wanted to back a candidate that did that. So he tested her. He walked into her office one Monday morning and he said, do I have an opportunity for you? I need someone to go to Aberdeen for 6 weeks. Fix this problem. We have a whole team that has collapsed there and all kinds of things are going wrong. You can fix it. Take your number 2 and sort it out. So she looked up from her desk and said, fantastic, when do I start? Now the next morning she remembered she had a 1-year-old and a few other responsibilities and maybe 6 weeks in Aberdeen was not going to quite come through. So she went back and she renegotiated and said, look, let's do it in 4-day chunks. I'll put my number 2 there permanently and this is how I can get this done. And he said it was fabulous because what she had done there was show that she was totally in touch with the opportunity. She was gung-ho. And I think what that story does is 2 things. Men not only have more junior men that they have been rubbing shoulders with for donkey's years, and that is the more obvious person to sponsor, but the thing we find that women get complicit about is not understanding the difference between a sponsor and a mentor. If you have ambivalences, go share it with your mentor. The thing you're supposed to be showing your sponsor is this, appreciation, this can-do thing. And, you know, again, Rosemary and I were talking about some of the data. It turns out that in the States, women will not apply for a senior position until they feel they have all 90% of the qualifications. A man will apply when he has 45%. And I think, you know, again, it comes out of this world of a very cozy, let's lean on your shoulder and let it all hang out kind of mentoring thing. I think mentors are fantastic and they are safety valves, but don't confuse it with your sponsor. A sponsor is someone you're trying to impress and can open the door for you. So you need both.
Hi, I was, sorry.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just wondering what your opinion on quotas is, whether that's like in top boardrooms or even on a low level, like in this country.
Right.
For example, now they're saying, you know, the BBC is always going to have one female panellist on a comedy show. What's your opinion on that sort of approach? And also, if you follow that, how do you avoid being seen as a token woman or getting to your position because they want more women as opposed to your own merits?
It's a great question because obviously quotas are very much in the news in Europe. As we understand, you know, various countries have put teeth behind it. Not true in the US, it's not an issue. So here's the thing. There's a tipping point. Unless 25% of a leadership group is female, they're not bringing their gender differences to the table. When you're in a very small minority, you tend to shut up about stuff that makes you different. There was a very fine study in the US which looked at Congress. And committees that had fewer than 25% women were very homogeneous in terms of the points of view expressed. Once you got women up to being a bit more of a critical mass, they were a force for a different kind of wisdom, a different kind of logic. So there is a tipping point. I think that unless you get 2 or 3 women on a 12, 13 person board, it is pretty irrelevant. But you've got to start somewhere. So, you know, the data I think shows that there is this 25% level that you should try and get to. The problem I have with some of the quota emphasis is that a lot of leadership really is about who are the key executives in an organization. Really not so much about the board. And what happened, you know, for a while in Europe is that you had the golden skirts. A small group of women, all of whom sat on 11 boards, right? And somehow you were able to tick the boxes because what had not happened is really changing the face of leadership so that you had a lot of fabulous women to choose from. So, you know, a lot of my work is really not about the board issue. I think the board will solve itself once we get a lot of amazing women in leadership positions in our many organizations. And that's where I put my emphasis. It's not that I'm against quotas. I just think it's slightly misplaced energy sometimes. Yes? Do you mind speaking English for the...
It's a translation service.
Okay. Un o'r pethau sydd yn amlwg yn y broses yma ydy fod angen I bobl neu merched wthio eu hunain mwyn I bobl fod yn ymwybodol o'ch ymdrechion a'ch llwyddiannau. Dydy hyn ddim yn wastad yn hawdd I ferched fel dwedoch chi yn gynharach ynglŷn â'r sefyllfa pan mae merched yn gwrthod trio am swyddion I bai bod nhw'n teimlo bod nhw'n gallu gwneud rhan fwyaf o'r swydd. Ac mae hyn yn ymwneud â hunan hyder, rhywbeth sydd ddim yn dod mor gynhenid I ni ferched y mae mewn dynion.
You know, that's a great question, and I thought we would take one more and I would try and respond to, because I know you would try.
No, it's... Oh, sorry.
my point was more an observation about the private sector versus public sector application of sponsorship.
Right.
So I don't know how those two link together. Really just to say, I think from the private sector perspective, advocating sponsorship to women is just recognising reality, and I think you've made that point very clear. But I do think the private sector is not particularly fond of the issue of fairness. No one says it has to be fair in the outcome. It has to be a good outcome for the business, and provided it's a good outcome for the business, that's fine. I think in a public sector environment, you have different issues about hiring process and fairness, and sponsorship could start to feel like, well, you're one of the golden anointed, and I don't think that perspective is so easy to implement. And I wondered if you had any public sector bodies that you were working with to share with us.
A great point. So let me go to both of them. The confidence thing, I think, is huge. So again, the reason I wrote this book on executive presence was essentially giving women and folks who do not match the identity of the leaders a more powerful and effective voice. And again, it's this magical trick of hanging on to your authenticity and the value of difference whilst being heard. And, you know, again, lots of stories as well as data, but I think you put your finger on a critical empowerment tool, which is in a way something which is quite individual. You don't need a company or an organization to help you do this. You know, you can go do it next month, and it has been a very powerful tool that we find, you know, is being used a lot. Going to your question, it's awfully important to get the story straight. Just think about it. What is the protege contributing? Performance, trustworthiness, and some special set of knowledge. In other words, it's profoundly meritocratic. Left to itself, the mini-me sponsorship reality gives a huge leg up to the folks who look like the leader. This is how it's going to be talked about. I mean, you can call them any name you like. I mean, you don't have to use this word sponsor if you feel that it's not a good word. It's Cisco, they call them advocates. You know, you can call them all kinds of things. So we do have 4 not-for-profit organizations putting this into practice. And I think, again, pointing out and having data around what happens if there's inaction is fascinating. I'll give you an example from Silicon Valley. It is not a level playing field of ideas. Now, no one's saying that an idea put on the table by any team member has to be endorsed and developed. I mean, most ideas don't warrant that. If you talk to venture capitalists, about 14% of ideas put on the table in Silicon Valley deserve to be endorsed. But you want to make sure that they're the best 14%. And not just the ideas put on the table by white guys. And what are the figures right now in Silicon Valley? An idea put on a table by an Asian woman in Silicon Valley has a 2% shot at getting endorsed. She's not heard. She's not valued. An idea put on a table by a Caucasian male has a 37% shot at getting endorsed. So I think, you know, knowing about the costs of inaction in terms of equitable access to power, you know, is one thing that is very dear to my heart. So maybe we will wind things up, yes? And let's gather over some refreshments. Thank you.
Well, I knew we were in for a treat, but I don't want anybody to sleep tonight because there's so many ideas rushing around people's heads. Fantastic. The question about quotas is interesting because I think our language is wrong. It should be quotas for men and leave it at that. That'd be the answer. So, Sylvia, it's been a real treat. Thank you so much. I think, we've had some fantastic speakers, but I think you've topped them all so far. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you've all found it quite inspiring. I've never seen so many smiling faces. It's really quite worrying. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a safe trip back to New York. I'm sure we'll be reading all your books. And, well, not often I'm lost for words, but I actually am tonight. So fantastic. Thank you so much.